I'm Representative Matt Manwiller from the 13th District. To my right is Joe Schmick from the 9th District and our lead on healthcare. Of course, you know the Senate Majority Leader, Mark Schessler, and my friend Steve O'Ban from the 26th? 28th,
Close.
that's what I said, yep. So anyways, this is our first media availability post-cutoff, or House of Origin cutoff. Just to give you a few numbers, the House passed out 376 bills, which have been delivered to the Senate. 122 of those were prime-sponsored by Republicans, and I'm sure you have some data on the numbers that you sent to us. And so we'll be back in policy committees this week, hearing those Senate bills, and waiting for whatever the Speaker determines as NTIB. For us, in the final 3 days before policy cutoff, I think the things that we were most excited about was the House citing, the school citing bill. That had been a Republican priority for years. As you know, the court has asked us to lower court sizes. Through initiative, the people have asked us to lower class sizes. Unfortunately, the Growth Management Act prevented the citing of schools, and so we were under a mandate to build more schools, but we couldn't build more schools, and so we had a nice bipartisan fix to allow schools to be cited outside the urban growth node, and we think that that will be incredibly significant for meeting some of the McCleary mandates and simply doing good things for kids to put them in smaller classroom sizes. So that's all the news that's fit to print in Lake Wobegon.
Well, thank you very much. You know, I think the Senate functioned in a very normal manner as we went through cutoff. You know, I think the highlights, obviously, everybody wrote about the levee cliff with some of the reforms that were in our plan as being part of it. The Hirsch decision, I think, had a very impressive bipartisan vote. We should remember that's important for all 39 counties within their unincorporated and rural areas, semi-rural, a really big deal. We're back starting to function again. We have a lighter than expected load in energy and telecom because we didn't get any bills over from the House. I think it'll take about a half an hour to hear all of those because they just didn't bother having executive session at the end. So we're back functioning normal, and that's the news.
The Congressional Budget Office is expected to release an analysis today that looks at the number of people that would be covered under under the Republican plan for health care. And so I just wanted to, I'm sure you guys are waiting to see those numbers as well, but the consensus is that some people will lose health care. Should the state backfill any costs that are related to people losing health care in the state if the repeal and replace plan moves forward?
Well, as you say, we haven't seen the numbers yet, and we'll take a look at those. But one thing I think we need to really be clear about is that as the bill sits now, the expansion population, and that's mainly what a lot of people are talking about, they will continue at that 90% federal coverage into, I mean, that just stays. That's how the bill sits right now. That won't change. Now, after January 1st, 2020, anybody new coming into the Medicaid program will be at our standard 50-50 match.
So is there anything additional that you believe the state should do, any of you, on when it comes to? Well,
I think it's a little early to tell, quite frankly. I mean, you and I are both waiting for the CBO score, kind of see where it's going to, what it's going to be. But you got to remember, as this bill moves through, it may pass the House, but once it gets into the Senate, it will have to be bipartisan before that passes and out of the Senate. So I think you're seeing the first rendition. Have we seen the final one? I kind of doubt it. So we'll just kind of have to wait and see. We have until January 1st, 2020. If things, change, that we'll have to take a look at, because I don't think there's anybody up here that wants to see anybody lose coverage. But to prognosticate now and guess when we really don't know, I think that's not wise.
Senator Schessler, do you have similar numbers for the number of bills passed out of the Senate and sent to the
I haven't committed them to memory nearly as well as
281 plus one House bill.
Somebody has.
Well, I haven't committed everything to memory, Jim, so.
Do you have a idea of when you're going to be unveiling your budget yet?
Soon.
Okay, would that be 2 weeks from now?
Soon.
The revenue forecast is on Thursday.
Yes.
Based on past precedent, it's usually shortly after the revenue forecast. But are you guys, do you have your numbers ready enough to where when the revenue forecast comes out, since it's usually just a couple $100 million here or there, will you be ready to release it as early as Friday, or do you anticipate it to be the following week?
Well, I think to plug in numbers that quickly, one day, would be a bit premature. But I think it'll be soon, Rachel, because we knew we had a job to do when we came here, because it's traditionally our turn. Our budget team is working hard, and they have it in a position that they can reconsider all of their policy options based on what that revenue forecast does.
On the front steps, there are some zombies. Today's the film lobby day, hoping for the tax incentive to be continued in the state. Is that a priority for you guys as you're looking at your budgets?
I thought you were talking about House members.
Hey, it's this daylight savings time, we all look like zombies, right? Well, you know, those tax preferences debates, it always seems to be somewhat paradoxical in the sense that we as, Republicans are always being yelled at, you need to close these corporate loopholes to fully fund McCleary, right? And yet, when we went back over the last 10 years, it turned out that 80% of all tax incentives or tax loopholes, whatever your language, was prime sponsored by Democrats, right? So it's kind of like, with one hand, they're saying you need to close the tax loopholes to fully fund education, but the data shows us that they're the prime sponsors of most of the tax loopholes. So I don't know where film incentives falls on the, string of what's our most important versus our least important, but, we're looking at bringing, jobs to rural Washington, the places that have been left behind, and that's probably going to be our number one focus.
Representative Manuel, two of your members introduced a bill last week to repeal the extension of the tax breaks for Boeing as a result of those jobs lost since the extension was given in 2013. Are you supportive of that?
Am I personally supportive of that, or is the caucus supportive of that?
I'll ask you rather than if you can speak for the caucus.
Yeah, I don't know if I feel comfortable speaking for the caucus. It's probably a job for Dan, and I haven't spoken to every member of my caucus, but I would say that there is some frustration with what has happened post, the incentives that we created in 2013. There was a commitment that there would be jobs that were tied to those, and we have seen a lot of job exodus. But we are also cognizant of the fact that the aerospace industry is a global industry. It's incredibly complicated. It's interdependent. And, Boeing is one player in a global market, and they are usually the recipient of global forces, not the creator of them. And so as jobs move around there and back and forth, you're going to have momentary consternation. But in the long run, we should remember that Boeing is one of our largest employers. They have a larger footprint in Washington State than any other. So I think that there's, both sides of that argument.
There's a work session today on the governor's clean air rule, and then a hearing, this is in the House tomorrow, on not the governor's carbon tax proposal, but a different one. I know that there are water projects in eastern Washington, the dam in southwest Washington, that are of interest to Republicans. To what extent is a carbon tax something that you think might be in play in terms of the final,
Slim and none. Slim and none.
Why do you say that?
Because you pick winners and losers in a carbon tax. I guarantee you, the average family that gasses their car up twice a week, or cars, and sees no improvement in congestion and less money for bread on the table, loses. Communities that don't have access to natural gas, that may still use heating oil, lose. We have schools that do, energy-intensive industries, and those that can't pass the costs on. So I think no matter what you do, you create losers in a global economy. As we compete with other states and other countries, we have a carbon tax and they don't, we will lose jobs.
Okay, but one of the arguments for dealing with carbon emissions is the fact you got problems with the snow melts, which goes into the irrigators, which is, it's directly affecting eastern Washington agriculture.
That was last year's story. This year, we have incredible snow melts, we have plenty of water, so that was last year's excuse.
Okay, but I did a story last year for a wine publication, and they're having problems with water going down the Yakima Basin at the wrong time of the year for the wine industry.
John, the thing about a carbon tax is to do it state by state is absolutely ridiculous. When you're going to do a carbon tax, it has to be in a closed system. So you do it nationwide or you do it internationally. But doing a state by state carbon tax is like building a square prison with 3 walls. Okay, it just makes absolutely no sense. Do you think that carbon stops at the Idaho border, that carbon stops at the, Vantage River? It just doesn't work that way. You have to have a closed system. So carbon taxes, whether you do them or don't do them, and we can have that argument, you don't do them state by state. You do them nationwide, internationally, or they don't work. And that's why internationally, one of the reasons that we abandoned cap and trade was that the Chinese and the Indians weren't on board. And if the Chinese and the Indians weren't on board, the whole system fell apart.
I also question the appetite for a tax, which that tax would be borne in part by the middle class. When we've had Sound Transit sort of suck the air, if there was ever any appetite for a new tax, Sound Transit has all but eliminated, I think, politically and for a tax when we've got so many people, I think in every single district within the Puget Sound area within the Transit Authority, filling our inboxes and the hot line with anger about this triple tax they're getting through the MVET inflated schedule that Sound Transit's basing its new tax on. So to talk about tax increases, whether it's the carbon tax, whether it's an income tax on capital, or the B&O tax increase, people are fed up, I think, with tax, any notion of a tax increase after opening up their car tax bills.
Senator, your bill and Senator Rossi dropped after a deadline. 5 bills in the House just dropped by Democrats to do the same things. Is this something that's going to be, because they're NTIB, going to be picked up this year?
Yeah.
A solution on both houses?
Oh, yeah. We have just got out of a meeting where we're discussing the relief we've got to provide to taxpayers on the MVET. And so the fact that we had some billing cutoffs, I think is not going to be an issue here. I think we'll have a bipartisan solution. We certainly should have one, a bipartisan solution that the governor has to sign to provide real tax relief to motorists.
So the House may vote this week on the new agency, Children and Families Agency. There is a fiscal note. What are your thoughts on how supportive the Senate and the Senate budget may be on this proposal, which I think you support in concept?
I do support in concept, but one of the absolute requirements, I think, was to have far more meaningful accountability on this new department. We need a cultural change. We can't just simply move over the same bureaucrats, the same managers from DSHS and expect we'll have a different outcome. So when we set up this new department, and this is why I am in support of it, is we have to set it up right. And that's one reason why I've insisted on an oversight board with real power, which my bill has, and I think those changes have been incorporated in the House project. But we're not done, I think, with adding additional accountability measures.
So what about the cost issue,
I think there's a willingness, but it's obviously going to be part of the overall budget discussions and final outcome if we can afford that department, that new department in this biennium. I hope that we can. I'm in favor of it, but that's going to be part of a much larger discussion, obviously.
Senator Chesler, do you support this?
I like the concept of it. I felt for pretty much my entire career that DSHS was too large, too diverse for good management, and we may be as close as we've ever been to taking a chunk of that away and starting over again.
And it makes sense with this behemoth of DSHS to start with the most vulnerable population, kids. That's where we should be focused, and I think that's one of the arguments for creating a department that is just focused on these kids that really need help, the most vulnerable at-risk kids. So that's a fitting place for us to begin a new way of thinking about how we deliver these important human services.
Jerry, here's another way of looking at the need for, or why a merger or split could make some sense. Look how many DSHS secretaries we go through in an administration or a decade. In some cases, I think by the time that person gets done putting out brush fires in one area, they haven't even seen this area, and then they're gone. I think, and look how long our DSHS has been without a director. And we're still waiting on that person. And when that person comes, it's going to take even the most capable manager a long time to learn about that entire mission of DSHS. So if we can put a good concept together with good reforms and some resources to start it, maybe this will be the year.
Do you expect to see it in your budget next week?
Very real possibility.
One thing I want to get back on Sound Transit, just a new thing I've learned since we had hearings in transportation, is that DOL collects the Sound Transit car tabs tax. That was something we already knew. What I found out was the contract, we are compensated, the state is, a little over $800,000 bucks to basically be the Sound Transit's bill collector. Most of that is just compensating DOL for credit card fees. So over $600,000 of that $800,000 is just basically reimbursing DOL for credit card fees. So we are not actually being compensated for the risk, liability that comes with collecting such an unfair and poorly calculated tax. We need that, DOL has got to renegotiate that contract, so it actually reflects the liability and exposure the state pays for being DOL's bagman, or excuse me, Sound Transit's bagman.
Senator O'Bannon, how come you and the caucuses don't accept any responsibility for approving the situation? Because it was part of the 2015 package, and it was language that was came out of both.
It was.
And you did not read the fine print, did you not ask the questions? How come the lawmakers are not owning up to something?
So glad you brought that up. So there was a letter that Senator Rossi and I wrote to General Ferguson just about the way that bill was drafted. I think it's unconstitutional. When you draft a bill, both the Constitution requires and our drafting pamphlet requires that you set forth the bill you're amending or referencing in its entirety, and then you show what you're striking out or what you're adding to that. In this case, the chapter and subsection that dealt with that particular inflated MVET had been repealed. It had been repealed by the voters actually twice. The first time the Supreme Court knocked it down, the second time the voters reinstituted it and it stuck. Well, it repealed that particular provision. When the 2015 bill was drafted, it did not even reference that specific provision. It's only referenced the chapter that it once had been included under. That is confusing, if not misleading, drafting. And I'm not suggesting that whoever drafted that intended to mislead, but that certainly was the effect. So it was an unconstitutional and improper way of drafting the bill. I'm not surprised that legislators and the governor who signed it had no idea that bill was reaching back and bringing back to life a repealed, dead MVET schedule that had been rejected by the voters.
Jerry, I'd add one thing to that. I was probably lobbied about as much as anybody short of Curtis King about the package. All Sound Transit's representatives said was, give us options or choices. Never once did they say we have to have $54 billion and have it all. They said, well, sales tax is a little high. We don't know if that's the way to go. Well, property taxes are sort of high. We don't want to go all property tax. We don't want to go big MVET. We know what happened. They never, ever said we're going for all of it. They just said, give us more choices. And that was not completely upfront with us, those of us who voted for the package.
Senator Van, do you want the Attorney General to go to court then to try to get an immediate overturning of the calculation rather than trying to get legislation?
Well, what we've asked in our letter is that the Attorney General would give us an opinion on the what we think is the unconstitutional bill in question. If the Attorney General says, I'm not prepared to do that because I might have to defend the law someday, we've asked him then to hire an outside firm to give us that legal opinion, which is certainly a lot of precedent for doing that.
So that's my also one remedy is a court.
So then we get an opinion. We get an opinion from the Attorney General saying, yeah, this was improperly drafted, it violates the Constitution. And then the next step, I think, would be the legislature, well, I'm hoping we do that in the session anyway, but I think that just gives additional rationale and basis for fixing that, what I think is unconstitutional law. If the legislature, I know it's not the Senate, but if the legislature somehow stops short of doing that, then the next step would be, I think, a lawsuit.
What do you think will ultimately happen with the 5G bill that did not cut off, but I understand might be in TIV?
I know that the industry is very interested in it. The governor has expressed interest in more deployment. So I think we'll be looking at it till the end of session.
What is your thought on the balance, striking the balance between what the wireless carriers say they need for some sort of regulatory uniformity across the state and what the cities are saying, which is that they should be able to preserve local control when it comes to this build out?
Well, the way some cities work, they see it as a cash machine. And if you allow that to happen, we will never be one of the first states to have that cutting edge communications.
This issue, like many others, seems to be testing state versus local control. And this year, on a number of fronts, Republicans have been accused of preempting local control. At the same time, we've got Democrats very supportive of states' rights suddenly. You and I have talked a little bit about this, but why are we seeing Republicans in some cases supporting the state stepping in and preempting?
Well, I think, Austin, you got to realize that we have these municipalities now that have taken, regulatory powers, I think, beyond what was typically used by city governments, right? You have this secure scheduling stuff. You've got their own ban the box. They're setting their own minimum wages. And I talk to people who they have employees that they put somebody in a truck in Vancouver and drive them up to Seattle. And in the course of that 4 hours, they will go through 4 different minimum wage zones, right? They will start in a state zone, they will go through a Tacoma zone, they will go through a SeaTac zone, and then they will go back to a state zone and then into a Seattle zone. You have to imagine what a nightmare that is, where you now have to log, well, I was in SeaTac for 37 minutes times 15, and I was in Seattle for 42 minutes times 1350, and you just get this patchwork of people trying to do business in our state, right? Seattle has its own ban the box. It's a little bit different than the ban the box we passed here. So which one do you follow, or do you have to follow both? So you've seen some interest in just bringing some type of uniformity. This is the same idea behind the Commerce Clause, was the idea that each state shouldn't set up its own tariff system. Well, we can't have every city setting up its own tariff system. So there has to be some uniformity so people can do commerce across the state.
But it sounds like what you're saying is that we do find ourselves in a moment in time in our state's history when there are more examples of this, there's perhaps more tension between state and local control.
Well, I think that tension is coming because you see municipalities venturing into areas of public policy that they traditionally have not been involved in, particularly the city council in Seattle. They're driving most of this.
Where do you expect the first 5239 bill to go in the House? What needs to be done to get that insurance passage?
Well, first they need to pass a Hearst bill, because they never brought it out during session, and obviously that was a very high priority. They have to pass a Hearst bill, or all 39 counties suffer. And right now, we have a system that is affordable, well understood, and has served our state well. The farther we veer from that, the more we hinder the ability for people to live outside of incorporated areas.
And one of the things that I would mention about Hearst that has been overlooked by a lot of people, particularly in Western Washington, is that they see the Hearst fix as a Eastern Washington issue. Let me tell you folks, it's not. When you have rural lands that are assessed and taxed, right, to pay for local governments, and the Hearst decision says, you can't put a well on that piece of property. It's not assessed at $200,000 anymore. It's now assessed at $30,000. That money doesn't go away. It shifts to other property. And you know where that other property is? In urban areas. The Hearst decision is a massive tax shift from the rural areas to the urban areas. If you reduce the value of my 200-acre farm because there's no water on it, you are going to increase the tax assessment on that high-raised condo in downtown. So I would suggest to my friends who represent urban Washington, generally my friends on the other side of the aisle, you should pay attention to Hearst too, because you're the ones who are going to be paying the bill as well.
Thank you, everyone.